At 9:47 in the morning on September 1, 1939, Mrs. Helena Kowalska stood in front of her third-grade classroom in Warsaw, explaining long division to 32 children who would never finish elementary school. Through the tall windows of the Krasinski School, she could see autumn leaves drifting across the courtyard. The chalk in her hand had just touched the blackboard when the air raid sirens began their first wail over the city. If we stop remembering their sacrifice, it's as if they died twice. Please subscribe to this channel so their stories are never forgotten. The children looked to her for reassurance. Mrs. Kowalska opened her mouth to speak and found she had no words. Her hands trembled. The chalk fell and broke against the floor. In the sudden silence between siren bursts, a 9-year-old girl named Janka Warschauer stood up from her desk in the second row. "We should go to the basement," she said. Her voice was steady in a way the teacher's was not. The other children followed Janka down the stairs while Mrs. Kowalska remained frozen at the blackboard, staring at the unfinished equation she would never complete. Janka had left her breakfast uneaten that morning. Scrambled eggs going cold on a blue plate. Her school bag still hung on the coat hook by her family's apartment door, filled with homework she had stayed up late to finish. Within 3 years, she would be prisoner number 27273 at Auschwitz. The eggs would be the last meal her mother ever cooked for her. In the next 6 years, 1.5 million children would die in ways their parents could not prevent, could not predict, could not comprehend. This is how it began. Not with soldiers or tanks or declarations of war, but with a teacher who froze and a child who led others to safety because someone had to, and all the adults had forgotten how. 14-year-old Freddie Overstegen sat in a cafe in Harlem in the spring of 1941, wearing lipstick her mother would have forbidden and a dress borrowed from her older sister Truus. Across the table, a Dutch Nazi collaborator smiled at her, thinking himself charming. He was perhaps 25, old enough to know better, young enough not to care. Freddie laughed at his jokes and suggested a walk in the woods beyond the city. She knew her resistance cell was waiting there with weapons she was too young to legally carry. The man paid for her coffee and offered his arm. In the moment before she stood, Freddie felt her hands go numb. She was 14. Her sister was 16. They had been recruited because men wouldn't suspect girls, because the Dutch resistance needed people willing to seduce targets to their deaths. She thought about her schoolbooks at home, about the piano lessons she used to take, about the person she might have been if Germany hadn't invaded. Then she stood, took the collaborator's arm, and walked him toward the trees. Years later, in interviews she rarely gave, Freddie said only this: "They were the enemy. We had to do it." She did not mention the nightmares that followed her for 60 years. She did not mention that she could never wear that shade of lipstick again without tasting copper in her mouth. 200 miles southeast, in the Warsaw Ghetto, a woman named Zofia Fikowska held her 6-month-old daughter Elżbieta for the last time. Irina Sendler, a Catholic social worker, had offered to smuggle the baby out in a carpenter's toolbox. Zofia had watched her neighbor's children starve. She knew what staying meant. She gave Elżbieta a sedative to keep her quiet and placed her in the box. Lieutenant Derek Sington of the British Army entered Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on April 15, 1945, and saw children who looked like elderly strangers. Their eyes were too large for their shrunken faces. Their bones pressed against skin that seemed transparent in the spring sunlight. A girl who might have been 8 years old approached him and asked in perfect English if he had any food. She weighed 35 pounds. Her mother had been a teacher in Vienna before the war and had taught her daughter proper grammar even as they starved together. The mother was dead now, somewhere in the piles of 13,000 unburied corpses that covered the camp grounds. Sington had been trained for combat. He had prepared himself to fight armed enemies, to take casualties, to make tactical decisions under fire. No one had prepared him for this. He turned away from the girl and vomited against a barracks wall while his radio operator called desperately for medical teams that would arrive too late for thousands. 3 months later, in August 1945, 300 child survivors of the Holocaust arrived at Lake Windermere in England's Lake District. British counselors tried to teach them normal childhood activities. A 16-year-old boy named Eric Hirsch stood on a soccer field, holding a ball he didn't understand. The counselor explained the rules. Eric stared at him blankly. He had survived Auschwitz and a death march that killed most of the men who started it. He had not played a game in 5 years. He had forgotten what playing meant. That night, the counselors gave Eric a bed with clean sheets and a soft mattress. He couldn't sleep. The bed felt wrong, too comfortable, like a trap. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered in the Holocaust. 5 million Soviet children died from starvation, bombs, and bullets. 13 million children total died in World War II. Behind each number was a name, a face, a last moment of fear that no one recorded. On the morning of August 4, 1944, someone knocked on the door of a secret annex in Amsterdam, and Frank, age 15, had been hiding there for 2 years with her family and for others. Karl Silberbauer, the Nazi officer who arrested them, later described and as ordinary-looking, resigned to her fate. She didn't cry or resist. She simply gathered her few belongings and walked down the stairs she would never climb again, and spent her last months in 3 different camps. First Westerbork, a transit facility in Holland, then Auschwitz in Poland, where she was separated from her father and never saw him again. Finally Bergen-Belsen in Germany, where she died of typhus in March 1945, just weeks before British troops liberated the camp. Her sister Margot died days earlier from the same disease. Their bodies were thrown into a mass grave with thousands of others. Hannah Goslar, Anne's childhood friend from Amsterdam, was also imprisoned at Bergen-Belsen. She spoke to and through a barbed wire fence one night in February, not knowing her friend was already dying. Hannah survived, and did not. The difference between life and death was nothing more than arbitrary chance. Otto Frank, Anne's father, was the only member of their family to survive Auschwitz. He returned to Amsterdam in June 1945 and spent weeks searching for his daughters, refusing to believe they were dead. When he finally learned the truth, he was told they had died in March, so close to liberation that the calendar itself seemed cruel. Tanya Savacheva was 11 years old when the German army surrounded Leningrad in September 1941 and began a siege that would last 900 days. Her mother gave her a small notebook meant for school assignments. Tanya used it to record something else. On December 28, 1941, she wrote in careful handwriting, "Genya died at 12 noon. Genya was her sister." On January 25, 1942, Grandma died at 3 p.m. Then came the others, each entry shorter than the last, as if she was running out of strength to form the letters. Lika died March 17th at 5 a.m. Uncle Vazia died April 13th at 2 a.m. Uncle Lisha, May 10th at 4 p.m. Mother on May 13th at 7:30 a.m. The final entry read, "Savachevs died. Everyone died. Only Tanya is left." She wrote those words alone in an apartment that still contained her family's bodies. She was 12 years old. Soviet authorities evacuated her from Leningrad in July 1942, but starvation had already destroyed her body beyond repair. She died in July 1944, 1 month after turning 14, never having fully recovered. Her diary was discovered after the siege and used as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Soviet prosecutors held up the small notebook with its child's handwriting to show Nazi defendants what their invasion had caused. In a hospital in Hiroshima in 1955, a 12-year-old girl named Sadako Sasaki folded paper cranes with hands that shook from leukemia. She had survived the atomic bomb 10 years earlier when she was 2 years old. The radiation had waited a decade before killing her. Japanese legend said that folding 1,000 paper cranes would grant a wish. Sadako folded 644 before she died. Her classmates folded the rest and buried them with her body. At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, prosecutors presented evidence of crimes against children to a courtroom filled with Nazi officials who had ordered or enabled their deaths. They showed photographs of children's bodies. They read testimonies from the few who survived. They displayed Tanya Savacheva's diary, pointing to each entry documenting a family member's death. The judges watched the defendants' faces for signs of remorse. They saw none. What the trials revealed was how ordinary people could rationalize participation in horror, how bureaucrats could sign orders condemning children and go home to dinner with their own families without feeling contradiction. After the war, Psychologists interviewed child survivors and heard the same question repeated. Why didn't anyone stop it? The adults had no answer. Allied governments had known about the Holocaust since 1942 but chose not to bomb the railway lines leading to the death camps. They feared civilian casualties. They prioritized other military targets. The trains kept running. The children kept dying. Some of those children grew into adults who spent their lives ensuring the dead would not be forgotten. Freddie Oversteegen, the teenage resistance fighter from Harlem, lived to 92 but rarely spoke about the men she had killed. Elżbieta Fikowska, smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto as a baby in a toolbox, devoted herself to honoring Irina Sendler, the woman who saved her. Setsuko Thurlow, who survived Hiroshima, became a nuclear disarmament activist and testified before the United Nations for decades. In 2017, she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. At Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, the walls of the Hall of Names are covered with photographs of murdered children. 13 million children died in World War II. They didn't choose to be brave. Adults forced them into courage by choosing violence. Thank you for your watching. Most of them received no medals, no monuments, only stories left behind. If this touched your heart, please subscribe so they will not be forgotten.